The hyena stood 4 feet from the tent, its head low, its eyes catching the last orange light of the dying fire. 9-year-old Grace Ellison did not scream. She did not run. She sat perfectly still on the wooden step of the family cabin, a cup of warm milk cooling in her small hands, and watched the animal the way she might watch a bird land on a fence post. Behind her, through the thin canvas wall, she could hear her father's voice rising in alarm, calling her name, telling her to come inside slowly. But something in Grace's chest stayed calm, steady, unafraid, and the hyena, after a long moment of studying her, turned its head away first. It backed off into the tall grass and vanished into the dark, leaving no sound behind except the soft rustle of stalks settling back into place. Her father, Edward Ellison, burst out of the cabin a heartbeat later, his flashlight beam sweeping wildly across the empty yard. He found his daughter sitting exactly where she had been, unharmed, her cup still warm, her face calm, in a way that unsettled him more than any scream could have. That night became the first story the family told about Grace, though it would not be the last. It was retold at dinner tables and campfires for years afterward, always ending the same way, with her father shaking his head and saying he still did not understand how a child could sit so still in front of a wild animal and feel nothing but curiosity. Grace grew up on the edge of a wildlife reserve in East Africa, where her parents ran a small research station studying the movement patterns of large predators. Her mother, Margaret Ellison, had trained as a nurse before moving to the continent, and she often treated injured animals brought in by local rangers when the nearest veterinary clinic was hours away. The family home sat at the boundary between farmland and wilderness, a place where the line between human life and animal life blurred every single night. Lions called in the darkness. Elephants passed through the maize fields, leaving flattened stalks in their wake. Leopards moved along the dry riverbed that cut behind the house, their presence known more by the tracks they left than by any sighting. Most children who grew up in that environment learned fear early. They learned which sounds meant danger, which shadows meant something was watching, which silences meant it was time to go inside. Grace learned those things too, but fear never seemed to take hold of her the way it did other children. Her parents noticed it first, in small ways. She would wander closer to the edge of the garden than her older brother ever dared. She would stand at the window during storms, watching for movement in the grass, rather than hiding under her blanket. She was not reckless. She simply seemed to carry a quiet confidence that made adults around her nervous, because they could not explain where it came from. By the time she was 12, Grace had built a habit of sitting outside at dusk, watching the tree line where the bush met the cleared land around the house. She kept a small notebook, one her mother had given her, and she filled its pages with rough sketches of paw prints, notes about which direction the wind was blowing, and observations about how different animals moved when they thought no one was watching. She was not trying to study anything formally. She simply found the animals more interesting than anything else in her small corner of the world, and watching them quietly became the thing she looked forward to most every day. One afternoon, when she was 13, a young ranger named Nathaniel Cole visited the research station to deliver supplies. He found Grace crouched near the fence line, perfectly still, watching a female leopard move along the riverbed with 2 young cubs trailing behind her. Most people who came across a leopard with cubs backed away immediately, understanding the danger of getting between a mother and her young. But Grace did not move, and the leopard, after pausing to look directly at her for several long seconds, simply continued walking, unbothered, as though the girl crouched by the fence was no more threatening than a fallen log. Nathaniel watched the entire exchange from a distance, careful not to interrupt, and when the leopard and her cubs had disappeared into the undergrowth, he walked over to Grace and asked her a question that would stay with her for the rest of her life. He asked her what she had been thinking about while the leopard looked at her. Grace thought about it for a moment before answering. She said she had not been thinking about anything at all. She had simply been watching, and somehow that felt different from being afraid. That answer stayed with Nathaniel long after he left the research station that day. He had spent years working with wildlife, tracking predators across the reserve, and he had seen many people freeze in fear when a dangerous animal appeared nearby. He had also seen people panic and run, which was often the worst possible response, but he had rarely seen anyone, let alone a 13-year-old girl, remain so naturally at ease in the presence of something that could easily end her life. He began visiting the research station more often after that, always finding reasons to check in on the family, though in truth, he had become curious about the girl who seemed to speak a different language than fear. Grace's childhood was not without difficulty. The reserve was not a peaceful postcard image of wilderness. Poaching was a constant threat in the region, and her father often left for days at a time to work with local authorities investigating traps and illegal hunting camps hidden deep in the bush. Grace grew up understanding that the wild animals she loved watching were also under constant threat from people who saw them only as objects to be sold. This understanding shaped her early on, giving her a sense of purpose that went beyond simple curiosity. She did not just want to watch animals. She wanted to protect them. By the time she turned 16, Grace had already spent hundreds of hours in the field with her father and with Nathaniel, learning to read tracks, to identify calls, to understand the subtle signs that indicated an animal's mood and intention. She learned that a predator's body language told a story long before any attack ever happened, and that most encounters between humans and dangerous animals were misunderstandings rather than true threats. She began to understand that fear often made those misunderstandings worse, turning a curious animal into a defensive one, or startling a resting predator into a reaction it never intended. Her mother worried about the amount of time she spent in the bush, especially as she grew older and ventured further from the house on her own. Margaret Ellison had seen too many injuries brought into her small clinic to feel completely at ease with her daughter's fascination with dangerous wildlife. But she also recognized something rare in Grace, a kind of instinct that could not be taught in any classroom, and she made peace with the fact that her daughter was drawn toward a life most people would run from. At 17, Grace experienced something that would later be remembered as one of the defining moments of her early life. She had gone out early one morning to check a set of camera traps her father had placed along a dry creek bed, a routine task she had done dozens of times before. As she knelt to change the memory card in one of the cameras, she heard a low sound behind her, barely more than a breath of air moving through grass. She turned slowly and found herself facing a male lion, alone, likely pushed out of his previous pride and wandering unfamiliar territory in search of a new one. Lone lions in that situation were often unpredictable, hungry, and far more dangerous than lions within an established pride. Grace did not run. She lowered herself slightly, avoiding direct eye contact in a way she had learned reduced the sense of challenge an animal might feel, and she waited. The lion took several slow steps toward her, testing, assessing, the way predators often do when deciding whether something is worth the risk of approaching. Grace kept her breathing steady, her body relaxed but alert, and she spoke softly, not out of any real belief that the lion understood her words, but because the low, even tone of a calm human voice often had a settling effect on wild animals that a sudden movement or silence did not. After what felt like several minutes but was likely only 30 seconds, the lion stopped his approach. He studied her for a long moment, his tail flicking once, twice, and then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the tall grass with the same unhurried confidence with which he had arrived. Grace remained kneeling by the camera trap for several minutes afterward, her hands trembling slightly now that the moment had passed, though her mind remained strangely clear throughout the entire encounter. When she told her father what had happened, he went pale and immediately drove out to the site to check for tracks, confirming her account and marking the encounter in his field records. That evening, he sat Grace down and told her something she would remember for the rest of her life. He said that most people who survived encounters like that survived because of luck, but he did not believe luck had anything to do with what had happened to her. He believed she had something else, something he could not name, and he told her that if she chose to build a life around wildlife, she needed to understand that gift was not a guarantee, it was a responsibility. Grace carried those words with her as she finished school and began to think seriously about her future. She had grown up surrounded by conservationists, rangers, and researchers, all of whom had chosen difficult, often dangerous careers because they believed the animals they protected mattered more than easier, safer lives elsewhere. She had watched her father come home exhausted after weeks tracking poachers through difficult terrain. She had watched her mother patch up injured rangers who had faced situations far more dangerous than anything she had experienced herself, and through all of it, she had never once considered choosing a different path. By the time she turned 18, Grace Ellison had made up her mind. She wanted to become a wildlife ranger, to work directly in the field protecting the animals she had grown up alongside. She wanted to use whatever strange, unexplainable instinct she carried within her, not as a party trick or a story told at dinner tables, but as a tool to keep both animals and people safer in the places where their worlds collided. She did not know yet how difficult that path would be, how many people would doubt her, or how many more encounters lay ahead of her, each one testing the very thing that made her different. But as she stood at the edge of the family property on the morning she left for ranger training, watching the sun rise over the reserve that had raised her, she felt something settle inside her chest, a quiet certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She did not know it then, but the world she was walking into would soon begin to notice the same thing her family always had. Predators that should have challenged her did not. Animals that reacted with aggression toward others seemed to hesitate in her presence, pause, reconsider, and often simply walk away. It would take years for anyone to understand why, and even longer for Grace herself to fully accept what it meant. But it began here, on a quiet morning at the edge of the bush, with a girl who had never learned to be afraid of the wrong things. The rifle felt heavy and wrong in Grace Ellison's hands, and she knew within the first week of training that she would never truly belong to the version of ranger work built around weapons alone. She stood on the firing range at the Kessington Wildlife Training Academy, sweat running down her back under the harsh midday sun, while an instructor barked corrections at her stance. Around her, 22 recruits, all but 3 of them men, moved through the same drills with a confidence Grace had not yet found. She hit her target, but her hands shook slightly afterward, not from fear of the weapon itself, but from a growing sense that this was not where her strength lived. Gideon Marsh, one of the senior instructors at the academy, noticed her hesitation immediately. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, who had spent 2 decades working anti-poaching patrols before moving into training new recruits. He had little patience for anyone who did not treat weapons training as the most important part of the program, and he made his opinion of Grace clear within her first month at the academy. He did not believe a young woman with soft hands and a quiet voice belonged on the front lines of wildlife protection, and he told her so directly during a review session in front of the entire class, suggesting she might be better suited to administrative work back at headquarters. Grace did not argue with him. She had learned long ago that arguing rarely changed anyone's mind, and she suspected that proving him wrong through her actions would matter far more than any words she might offer in her own defense. She continued attending every session, pushing through the physical training that left her muscles aching, studying late into the night to memorize animal behavior patterns, terrain navigation, and emergency protocols. She was not the strongest recruit in the group, and she knew it. But she began to notice something the other recruits had not yet developed, something that had nothing to do with physical strength. During a night navigation exercise designed to simulate a tracking mission through unfamiliar terrain, Grace's group encountered a herd of buffalo resting near the planned route. Buffalo were considered among the most dangerous animals in the region, unpredictable and capable of sudden, aggressive charges when startled. The instructor leading the exercise, a quiet man named Daniel Ashford, who had grown increasingly interested in Grace's file after hearing rumors about her background, called for the group to freeze and wait for his signal on how to proceed. In the darkness, panic began spreading quietly through the recruits. Someone's breathing grew loud and fast. Someone else shifted their weight, causing a stick to snap under their boot. The buffalo, sensing the disturbance, began to stir, several of them rising to their feet, heads turning toward the source of the sound. Daniel Ashford felt the situation tipping toward danger, the kind of moment that could end a training exercise with real injuries if handled poorly. Grace stepped forward without being told to. She moved slowly, deliberately, her posture low and unthreatening, and she began speaking in the same low, steady tone she had used years earlier when facing the lone lion near her childhood home. The other recruits stared at her in confusion, unsure whether she was breaking protocol or somehow understanding something they did not. The buffalo that had risen to their feet paused, ears swiveling toward her voice, and after a long, tense silence, they settled back down into the grass, their attention shifting away from the group entirely. Daniel Ashford watched the entire sequence unfold with a mixture of surprise and quiet recognition. He had spent years around wildlife himself, and he understood immediately that what he had just witnessed was not luck. It was a skill, however unconventional, and one that could not be taught through the standard curriculum the Academy relied on. He said nothing to the group in the moment, allowing the exercise to continue, but he made a note in his private evaluation of Grace that night, one that would eventually reach the desk of the Academy's director. Word of the incident spread quickly among the recruits, though the story shifted slightly with each retelling. By the time it reached Gideon Marsh, the version he heard made Grace sound reckless, rather than skilled, someone who had gotten lucky, rather than someone who had genuinely diffused a dangerous situation. He confronted her about it the next morning, questioning her judgment for stepping forward without authorization, warning her that instincts alone would not save her in a real crisis. Grace listened patiently, then asked him a simple question in return. She asked him what he believed would have happened if she had not stepped forward. Gideon did not have an answer, and the silence between them stretched long enough that several other recruits nearby noticed it too. Despite the growing tension with Gideon, Grace found an unexpected ally in Charlotte Hughes, a fellow recruit who had grown up in the city and had no prior experience with wildlife before joining the Academy. Charlotte had chosen the path for different reasons than Grace, driven more by a passion for environmental science than any personal history with dangerous animals. The two women became close during the grueling months of training, supporting each other through physical exhaustion, homesickness, and the persistent skepticism they both faced from some of their male peers. Charlotte often said that watching Grace work reminded her why she had chosen this path in the first place, even on days when she doubted her own ability to keep up. As training progressed into its final months, the Academy introduced a series of live field simulations designed to test recruits under conditions as close to real ranger work as safety would allow. These simulations took place within a controlled section of the reserve, where recruits were paired into small teams and given tasks involving tracking, animal monitoring, and conflict de-escalation. Grace was paired with two other recruits for a simulation involving a suspected illegal snare line deep in dense bush terrain, an assignment considered one of the more difficult scenarios in the program. The team moved carefully through the undergrowth, following a set of tracks that suggested recent human activity in the area. Grace's instincts, sharpened by years of watching animal behavior with her father, told her something was wrong before her teammates noticed anything at all. She signaled for the group to slow down, pointing toward a patch of disturbed earth that indicated a possible trap concealed beneath the leaves. Her caution likely prevented a simulated injury that would have ended the exercise early, and the instructors monitoring the team's progress from a distance took careful note of her observation skills. Moments later, as the team continued their search, they came across a female warthog with piglets trailing behind her, clearly agitated by the presence of humans so close to her young. Warthogs, though smaller than many other animals on the reserve, could become fiercely defensive when their offspring felt threatened, and a startled charge from an adult warthog was capable of causing serious injury. Grace's teammates instinctively reached for their equipment, preparing to retreat or defend themselves if necessary. But Grace held up a hand, signaling them to stay still. She crouched low, keeping her body language small and non-threatening, and waited. The warthog stared at her for several long seconds, snorting once in warning, before gathering her piglets and moving away into the thicker brush. The entire encounter lasted less than a minute, but it left a lasting impression on the two recruits paired with her, both of whom later admitted to instructors that they had never seen anyone remain so calm in the presence of an animal capable of causing real harm. By the end of the training program, the instructors gathered to review each recruit's overall performance, discussing strengths, weaknesses, and readiness for field placement. Gideon Marsh remained openly skeptical of Grace's suitability for frontline work, arguing that her unconventional approach could not be relied upon in situations involving armed poachers or genuinely hostile human threats, areas where her gift with animals offered no advantage at all. Daniel Ashford disagreed strongly, presenting his documented observations from the training exercises as evidence that Grace possessed a rare and valuable skill set that complemented, rather than replaced, traditional ranger training. The final decision fell to the Academy's director, a woman named Charlotte's own aunt through an unrelated coincidence that had nothing to do with the outcome, who had built her career advocating for more diverse approaches to conservation work across the region. After reviewing the evaluations from multiple instructors, she made the decision to place Grace on a probationary field assignment at one of the Trust's most active outposts. A decision that surprised many recruits, but confirmed what Nathaniel Cole had believed about her since she was 13 years old, watching a leopard move past her without fear. Grace's first assignment placed her at a remote outpost bordering a section of the reserve known for frequent conflict between wildlife and nearby farming communities. Elephants regularly raided crops during the dry season, drawn by the promise of easy food, and tensions between frustrated farmers and the animals they viewed as a threat to their livelihoods often escalated into dangerous confrontations. Her role would involve responding to these conflicts directly, working to guide elephants away from farmland without resorting to methods that might injure the animals or provoke further aggression. Her first week at the outpost was quiet, giving her time to familiarize herself with the terrain, the local community, and the small team of rangers she would be working alongside. But quiet rarely lasted long in that part of the reserve, and within her second week, Grace received an urgent radio call reporting an elephant bull that had broken through a fence line and was moving aggressively through a maize field less than 2 kilometers from the outpost. The farmer who owned the field had already gathered several neighbors, some of them armed with makeshift tools, determined to drive the animal off before it destroyed the last of their harvest. Grace arrived at the scene to find a tense standoff already forming, the elephant standing at the center of the field, ears flared wide, trunk raised in clear agitation, while a group of 6 or 7 men shouted and threw stones in an attempt to scare it away. The situation was rapidly escalating toward disaster, the kind of confrontation that too often ended with either an injured farmer or a dead elephant, sometimes both. Grace understood immediately that shouting louder or adding more noise to the chaos would only make things worse, and she made a decision that went against everything the frightened farmers expected from a ranger arriving to help them. She walked directly toward the elephant, alone, her hands empty, her pace slow and unhurried. Behind her, she heard someone shout a warning, telling her to get back before she was killed. She did not stop. She kept her eyes lowered slightly, avoiding the kind of direct stare an elephant might interpret as confrontation, and she began speaking softly, the same low and steady tone that had settled the buffalo during her training exercise months earlier. The elephant's ears remained flared for several long seconds, its trunk swinging in agitation, and the farmers behind Grace fell silent, watching in stunned disbelief as she closed the distance between herself and an animal capable of ending her life in an instant. The elephant took one step forward, testing, and Grace held her ground without flinching. Then, slowly, its ears began to fold back against its head, its trunk lowering, the tension visibly draining from its massive frame. It turned, almost reluctantly, and began moving back toward the tree line, away from the field, away from the frightened crowd, guided by nothing more than the quiet presence of a young woman who had somehow convinced it there was no threat worth fighting for. The farmers stood in stunned silence as the elephant disappeared into the trees, the maize field saved, no injuries sustained on either side. Word of the incident spread through the local community within hours, and by the following week, it had reached the Trust's regional headquarters, carried by rangers who had heard the story secondhand and could hardly believe it themselves. Gideon Marsh, informed of the incident during a routine briefing, said nothing, though several colleagues later noted that his skepticism toward Grace seemed to soften, if only slightly, after hearing the details. For Grace, the encounter confirmed something she had suspected since childhood, but had never fully trusted until now. Whatever instinct guided her through these moments was not something she could fully explain, but it was real, and it worked, not through dominance or force, but through a kind of quiet understanding that animals seemed to recognize instantly, even when the humans around her could not. As she walked back to the outpost that evening, the adrenaline of the encounter slowly fading from her body, she allowed herself, for the first time since beginning her training, to believe that she truly belonged in this work, not despite the fact that she carried no weapon, but perhaps because of it. The rope of the snare had cut deep into the lioness's front leg, and the wound had turned raw and swollen after days of struggling against it. Grace Ellison did not know any of this yet, as she climbed down into the narrow ravine, following a trail of broken branches and disturbed earth that her tracking instincts told her meant something was badly wrong. She had been at the outpost for nearly a year by this point, her reputation quietly growing among the local rangers, though she still had no idea how much that reputation was about to be tested. She had set out that morning with a small team to investigate reports of illegal snares along the northern boundary of the reserve, an area known to attract poachers because of its distance from the main patrol routes. Her radio crackled with static as she moved deeper into the ravine, the signal weakening the further she descended into the rocky terrain. Her two teammates, a ranger named Peter Langford and a tracker named Ruth Okafor, had split off to check a separate trail less than a kilometer away, leaving Grace alone when she found the first signs of the wounded animal. The ravine narrowed sharply ahead of her, its walls rising steep and rocky on either side, the kind of terrain that offered almost no room to maneuver if something went wrong. Grace paused at the entrance, studying the tracks in the dirt, and felt a familiar tightening in her chest, not quite fear, but a heightened awareness that told her to move carefully. She had learned to trust that feeling over the years, and she considered turning back to wait for her teammates before continuing further. But the tracks ahead showed clear signs of blood, and she knew that whatever animal had left this trail was suffering, and possibly dying, somewhere close by. She moved forward slowly, scanning the rocks above her for any sign of movement, her radio still crackling uselessly against her hip. The air in the ravine felt heavier than the open bush above, the walls trapping heat and sound, in a way that made every rustle of grass seem louder than it should have been. She rounded a bend in the narrow passage and stopped immediately, her entire body going still. The lioness lay pressed against the far wall of the ravine, no more than 15 feet away, her front leg wrapped in the twisted remains of a wire snare that had cut through skin and muscle over what had clearly been several agonizing days. Her eyes locked onto Grace the moment she appeared, and instead of the wary hesitation Grace had seen in countless other encounters, this animal's gaze carried something far more dangerous, a mixture of pain, exhaustion, and cornered desperation. There was no room to retreat behind her, no clear path back the way she had come, without turning her back on an injured predator that had nothing left to lose. Grace understood immediately that this situation was different from anything she had faced before. The techniques that had worked with the buffalo, the warthog, the elephant, all relied on giving the animal a clear path away from perceived danger, a way to choose calm over confrontation. But a wounded, trapped predator in a narrow ravine had no such option. There was nowhere for the lioness to retreat to, and pain had likely stripped away much of the caution that normally governed her behavior around humans. Every instinct in Grace's body told her to run, and every piece of training she had received told her that running was the single worst thing she could do. She lowered herself slowly to the ground, moving with agonizing patience, keeping her movements small and predictable. The lioness's ears flattened against her skull, a low growl building somewhere deep in her chest, a sound that vibrated through the rocky walls of the ravine and settled into Grace's bones. She had heard lions vocalize many times before, but never this close, never with this much raw pain and threat woven into the sound. Her hands, resting flat against the dirt in front of her, trembled slightly despite her best efforts to remain still. Grace began speaking, her voice barely above a whisper, the same low and steady tone she had relied on so many times before, though she had never used it under circumstances this dire. She did not move closer. She did not look away entirely, understanding that complete avoidance of eye contact could sometimes be read by a cornered animal as an opening to strike, while direct, sustained eye contact could be read as a challenge. She found a careful middle path, glancing toward the lioness periodically, while keeping her posture low, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing as even as she could manage despite her racing heart. Minutes passed in this way, though it felt to Grace like hours. The lioness's growl continued intermittently, rising and falling with what Grace recognized as waves of pain from the wound on her leg. At one point, the animal shifted her weight, attempting to rise, and let out a sound of pure agony that echoed off the ravine walls, a sound so raw that Grace felt her own throat tighten in sympathy, despite the danger of her position. The lioness settled back down, breathing hard, her eyes never fully leaving Grace's kneeling form. Grace realized, as she remained frozen in place, that this encounter would not resolve the way the others had. The lioness could not simply walk away from the threat she perceived, because the pain in her leg had trapped her as surely as any cage. Grace understood that her survival, and perhaps the lioness's survival as well, depended on something more than the quiet stillness that had worked before. She needed the animal to understand, on some level neither of them could fully articulate, that she posed no threat at all, not even the possibility of one. She began, very slowly, to lower herself further, until she was sitting rather than crouching, a posture that made her appear smaller and less capable of sudden movement. She kept her hands visible, resting open on her knees, and she continued speaking in that same low murmur, though now the words themselves became less important than the steady, unbroken rhythm of her voice. Somewhere above the ravine, she heard the distant call of a bird, and the sound seemed to break some of the tension coiled in the air between them. The lioness's growling slowly began to soften, not disappearing entirely, but losing some of its sharp edge. Her ears, which had remained flattened against her skull for what felt like an eternity, twitched slightly, shifting into a position that suggested wariness rather than pure aggression. Grace did not move closer. She understood, with a clarity that surprised even her, that closing the physical distance between them would undo everything the last several minutes had accomplished. Instead, she simply stayed, patient, unmoving, present. It was nearly 20 minutes before Grace heard the distant sound of voices calling her name. Peter Langford and Ruth Okafor, searching for her, after losing contact over the radio. She did not respond immediately, afraid that a sudden shout might startle the wounded animal into a desperate lunge. Instead, she waited until the voices grew closer, and when Ruth's silhouette appeared at the entrance to the ravine, Grace raised one hand slowly, palm open, signaling for her colleague to stop and remain silent. Ruth froze instantly, taking in the scene before her. The wounded lioness pressed against the rock wall, Grace sitting calmly on the ground between the animal and the only way out of the ravine. She had heard the stories about Grace's unusual ability with wildlife, but seeing it in person, understanding the true danger of the situation, left her rooted in place, uncertain of what to do next. She radioed for Peter, keeping her voice low, and together they waited, watching from a safe distance, as Grace remained exactly where she was. Word had reached the outpost by now, and within the hour, a small team arrived carrying a tranquilizer kit and veterinary supplies, prepared to sedate the lioness so her wound could be treated properly. But administering a tranquilizer safely required the animal to remain calm enough for an accurate dart placement, and any sudden panic could send her charging in an unpredictable direction, potentially toward the very people trying to help her. The team looked to Grace, still sitting quietly at the edge of the ravine, and understood without needing to be told that she was the only reason the situation had not already ended in tragedy. Grace remained in position while the veterinary team prepared the tranquilizer dart, speaking softly the entire time, her presence apparently serving as an anchor that kept the wounded lioness from spiraling into full panic, despite the increasing activity around her. When the dart finally struck, the lioness let out one final, exhausted growl before her muscles slowly relaxed, her head sinking down against the rocky ground as the sedative took hold. Only then did Grace finally rise to her feet, her legs stiff and aching from remaining still for so long, her hands still trembling slightly as the adrenaline of the encounter began to fade. The veterinary team worked quickly once the lioness was sedated, carefully cutting away the wire snare embedded in her leg and cleaning the wound before it could develop a dangerous infection. Grace stood back and watched, exhaustion settling over her in waves, now that the immediate danger had passed. Ruth approached her quietly, placing a hand on her shoulder, and asked her the same question so many people had asked before. She wanted to know how Grace had known what to do, how she had managed to stay so calm in a situation that would have ended in tragedy for almost anyone else. Grace considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. She said she had not known what to do, not with any certainty. She had simply understood, somewhere beneath conscious thought, that fear would only make everything worse, both for herself and for the animal in front of her. She said that pain and desperation, whether in an animal or a person, rarely responded well to more fear being thrown into the situation. What both seemed to need, more than anything else, was the sense that someone nearby was not going to make things worse. News of the ravine encounter spread through the Wildlife Trust far faster than any previous story about Grace, carried not just by rangers who had heard second-hand accounts, but by the veterinary team who had witnessed the entire event firsthand and could vouch for every detail. Gideon Marsh, who had spent months quietly doubting Grace's place among the Trust's rangers, found himself unable to dismiss this incident the way he had dismissed the earlier stories. A cornered, wounded predator in a confined space was widely considered one of the most dangerous scenarios a ranger could face, and Grace had walked away from it without a single injury, and more remarkably, without causing harm to the animal either. The regional director of the Wildlife Trust requested a formal report on the incident, intending to use it as a case study for future ranger training programs. Grace found herself sitting across from senior officials she had never met, explaining, as best she could, the instincts and techniques she had relied on during those tense minutes in the ravine. She struggled to put the experience into words that satisfied the scientific-minded officials asking for concrete explanations. She spoke of body language, of tone, of patience, but she also admitted, with a kind of honesty that surprised the room, that some part of what happened in that ravine went beyond anything she could fully explain, even to herself. In the weeks that followed, the lioness recovered from her wound under close monitoring, her leg healing enough for her to be released back into the wild, fitted with a tracking collar that would allow the Trust to monitor her movements and ensure she was hunting successfully on her own. Grace visited the recovery enclosure several times during the lioness's treatment, always keeping a respectful distance, though she noticed something she found difficult to explain to anyone else. The lioness, upon seeing her approach, no longer displayed the aggressive tension that marked most of her interactions with unfamiliar humans. She would simply watch, calm, almost curious, as though some quiet understanding had passed between them during those long minutes in the ravine, an understanding that outlasted the danger that had first brought them together. The day the lioness was finally released back into the reserve, Grace stood among the small group of rangers and veterinary staff who had gathered to witness the moment. As the transport crate opened, and the lioness stepped cautiously out into the tall grass, she paused, turning her head back toward the group for a brief moment, before continuing on into the bush. Several rangers later swore that her gaze had lingered specifically on Grace, though Grace herself remained quiet about the moment, unwilling to claim more meaning from it than the facts could support. What could not be disputed, however, was the shift that had taken place within the Wildlife Trust following the ravine incident. Rangers who had once viewed Grace with polite skepticism now sought her out for advice on handling difficult wildlife encounters. Younger recruits arriving at the academy began asking about her by name, having heard fragments of the story from instructors eager to use it as an example of instinct paired with genuine skill. And somewhere within the Trust's leadership, a quiet conversation began about whether Grace's unusual gift represented something worth studying more formally, a question that would shape the next chapter of her career in ways she could not yet imagine as she walked away from the ravine that day, carrying with her the memory of a wounded animal's eyes, finally softening in recognition rather than fear. By the time 3 years had passed since the ravine incident, Grace Ellison's reputation had grown far beyond the boundaries of the reserve where she worked. Rangers from neighboring trusts began requesting her assistance during especially difficult wildlife conflicts, situations where standard protocols had failed to resolve tension between animals and nearby communities. She rarely sought out this attention herself, preferring the quiet, steady work of her daily patrols, but the calls kept coming, and she found it difficult to turn away from situations where her presence might prevent unnecessary harm. One such call brought her to a research station nearly 200 kilometers from her usual outpost, where a clan of spotted hyenas had begun approaching field researchers with unusual boldness, driven by a prolonged drought that had pushed normal prey populations further from their territory. The station's lead researcher, a soft-spoken man named Owen Whitcomb, had grown increasingly concerned for his team's safety after a hyena had entered the camp's kitchen tent during daylight hours, an event almost unheard of under normal circumstances. Grace arrived to find a team of exhausted researchers who had taken to carrying makeshift noisemakers everywhere they went, jangling cans and shouting whenever a hyena appeared near the camp's perimeter. The constant noise and tension had done little to discourage the animals, and had instead created an atmosphere of mutual anxiety that made every encounter more unpredictable than the last. Grace spent her first 2 days simply observing the clan from a distance, studying their movement patterns, noting which individuals seemed to be driving the bolder behavior and which remained more cautious. On the third evening, as the sun dropped low over the dry riverbed near the camp, 3 hyenas approached the perimeter fence together, their posture confident in a way that suggested they no longer viewed the camp as a place to avoid. The researchers reached instinctively for their noisemakers, but Grace raised a hand, asking them to wait. She walked slowly toward the fence line alone, her movements unhurried, and settled onto the ground roughly 20 feet from where the animals had gathered. She did not shout. She did not wave her arms or make herself appear larger, the way conventional wisdom often suggested when facing a potentially aggressive animal. Instead, she remained still, watching the hyenas with the same quiet patience she had shown countless predators before them. The largest of the 3, clearly a dominant female, based on her posture and the deference the others showed her, studied Grace for a long moment before letting out a low, questioning call, one that Owen Whitcomb later described as unlike any vocalization he had recorded from the clan during months of observation. Grace responded with nothing more than continued stillness, her breathing steady, her gaze neither challenging nor submissive. After several tense minutes, the dominant female turned and moved away from the fence, her 2 companions following without hesitation. The camp remained free of bold hyena visits for the remainder of Grace's stay, and Owen Whitcomb, fascinated by what he had witnessed, began documenting her methods with the same rigor he applied to his research on the clan itself. It was Owen who first suggested, in a paper he later submitted to a regional conservation journal, that Grace's success might stem not from any mystical connection with animals, but from a highly refined ability to read and respond to subtle behavioral cues that most people never learn to notice. He pointed to her steady breathing, her controlled posture, and the specific pitch and rhythm of her voice as measurable factors that likely influenced how animals perceived her presence. He also noted, with clear scientific caution, that these factors alone did not fully explain the consistency of her success across such a wide range of species and situations, leaving room for further study that he hoped others might eventually pursue. Not everyone within the scientific community accepted Owen's theories without skepticism. A colleague of his, a researcher named Vivian Ashcombe who specialized in animal cognition, argued that behavioral cues alone could not account for encounters as extreme as the wounded lioness in the ravine, where pain and desperation should have overridden any calming influence a human's posture or tone might provide. She proposed instead that some individuals might carry subtle differences in scent or pheromone production that registered differently to animals on a level science had not yet fully mapped. The debate between these 2 theories continued for years without clear resolution, and Grace herself remained largely uninterested in settling it, more concerned with the practical outcomes of her work than with proving any particular explanation correct. As her reputation grew, so did the challenges she faced. Word of her abilities eventually reached beyond the conservation community, drawing attention from journalists eager to write sensational stories about a woman who could supposedly tame wild predators with nothing more than her presence. Grace found these portrayals frustrating, feeling that they stripped away the years of careful observation and training that had shaped her methods, replacing genuine skill with something closer to magic. She agreed to only a handful of interviews, always careful to emphasize that her approach relied on discipline and understanding, rather than any supernatural gift, though the more dramatic headlines rarely reflected the nuance of her explanations. The growing attention also brought a different kind of danger into her life. A group of poachers operating in a region she had recently helped patrol grew increasingly aware of her reputation, and rather than viewing her as a mere obstacle, some began to see her as a specific target, believing that removing her from the reserve would make their operations significantly easier. Grace's supervisors grew concerned enough to assign additional security measures during her patrols, a development she accepted reluctantly, understanding the necessity even as it clashed with her preference for working quietly and independently. One particular figure among the poaching networks operating near the reserve became especially persistent in his efforts to undermine the trust's anti-poaching operations. A man known locally as Victor Lang had built a reputation for evading capture through careful planning and a network of informants within nearby communities. Rangers had pursued leads on his operations for years without success, and his continued presence remained a significant threat to the animals, under the trust's protection. During a routine night patrol along a section of fence line known for frequent breaches, Grace and her patrol partner, Daniel Ashford, now a senior ranger himself after years of working alongside her, came across fresh signs of illegal activity near a section of damaged fencing. Following the tracks cautiously, they discovered an active snare line clearly set within the past few hours, along with signs suggesting the poachers responsible were still somewhere nearby, likely waiting to check their traps under cover of darkness. As they moved to document the snares and radio for backup, a low growl emerged from the darkness ahead of them, distinct from the sound any human intruder might make. Grace immediately raised a hand, signaling Daniel to stop, her instincts sharpened by years of experience recognizing the subtle differences between the sounds of frightened prey animals and the low, warning vocalizations of a predator preparing to defend territory. Moments later, a pack of African wild dogs emerged from the surrounding brush, clearly agitated, their pack having likely lost a member to one of the very snares Grace and Daniel had just discovered. Wild dogs, though smaller individually than lions or hyenas, hunted with a coordinated intensity that made an agitated pack genuinely dangerous, particularly when their aggression had already been heightened by the loss of a pack member. Daniel's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, a reasonable response given the circumstances, but Grace reached out and gently pressed his arm down, understanding that drawing a weapon in this moment would almost certainly escalate rather than resolve the situation. She stepped slightly ahead of him, lowering herself into the same calm, grounded posture that had worked so many times before, though she understood that a full pack, moving with coordinated purpose, rather than the solitary desperation of the wounded lioness years earlier, presented an entirely different kind of challenge. She spoke softly, her voice carrying just enough to reach the nearest dogs without startling them further, and she watched carefully as the pack's movement patterns shifted in response, some individuals pausing, others continuing to pace with restless energy. The standoff lasted several long minutes, the pack circling at a cautious distance, testing the boundaries of the situation, the way predators often did, when uncertain whether prey or threat stood before them. Grace remained still, resisting every instinct that urged her to retreat toward the safety of the vehicle, parked further down the fence line. Slowly, the pack's energy began to shift, the coordinated tension easing into something closer to wary curiosity, and one by one, the dogs began to withdraw, disappearing back into the darkness from which they had emerged, leaving Grace and Daniel alone once more, beside the broken fence line and the evidence of the poacher's snares. Daniel later admitted, when recounting the incident to colleagues back at the outpost, that he had fully expected the encounter to end in serious injury for at least one of them. He struggled to explain what he had witnessed, though he offered his own theory, one that many rangers who worked alongside Grace eventually came to share. He believed that animals, far more than humans often gave them credit for, could sense genuine intention, and that Grace carried within her an absence of the fear and aggression that so often provoked defensive violence in the animals she encountered. Whatever threat or uncertainty an animal might read in another person's presence simply was not there in hers, and in its place, the animals seemed to find something closer to trust. The snare line discovery that night eventually led investigators back to Victor Lang's network, providing evidence that contributed to a larger operation targeting his activities across the region. Though Lang himself evaded capture for several more months following the incident, the disruption to his operations near Grace's outpost significantly reduced poaching activity in that section of the reserve, a quiet but meaningful victory that rarely made it into any of the more dramatic stories circulating about her. As the years continued to unfold, similar encounters accumulated steadily, each one adding another layer to the reputation that had begun forming when Grace was still a child, sitting calmly in front of a hyena outside her family's cabin. Crocodiles that should have viewed her as easy prey along riverbanks instead retreated into deeper water at her approach. A cornered honey badger, an animal known throughout the region for its fearless aggression even against much larger predators, backed away from a confrontation with Grace, rather than pressing forward as it had with every other human who had crossed its path. Elephants that trumpeted warnings at approaching vehicles fell quiet and calm when Grace stepped out to approach them on foot. Scientists continued to debate the precise explanation behind these patterns, publishing papers, conducting careful observational studies, even attempting, with Grace's reluctant cooperation, controlled experiments designed to measure physiological differences between her presence and that of other experienced rangers facing similar situations. Some findings suggested measurable differences in heart rate variability and breathing patterns that remained remarkably stable, even during moments of extreme danger, a stability most humans could not replicate, even with extensive training. Other findings remained inconclusive, unable to fully account for the consistency and range of species involved across her many documented encounters. For Grace herself, the accumulating evidence and ongoing scientific curiosity mattered less than the practical reality of her daily work. Each encounter, whether with a wounded predator, an agitated herd, or a defensive pack, represented a chance to prevent harm, to protect both the animals she had dedicated her life to and the rangers and community members who worked alongside her. She had long since stopped trying to explain the instinct that guided her, focusing instead on refining it, teaching what could be taught to younger rangers, and accepting, with a quiet humility that surprised those who expected someone with her reputation to carry more confidence, that some part of what she carried within her might never be fully understood, by herself or by anyone else studying her remarkable career. 15 years after the night a hyena had stood 4 feet from a 9-year-old girl on a wooden step, Grace Ellison stood at the edge of a training field, watching a young recruit freeze in the presence of a full-grown leopard during a supervised field exercise. The recruit's name was Iris Kellerman, barely 20 years old, her hands trembling around the radio clipped to her vest, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts that carried clearly across the quiet distance, separating her from the animal. Grace recognized the fear immediately, not because she had ever felt it in quite the same way herself, but because she had spent years now learning to recognize it in others, and to understand how to guide someone through it before it turned dangerous. She spoke into her own radio, her voice calm and unhurried, the same steady tone that had settled countless animals over the years, though now she directed it toward a frightened young woman rather than a predator. She told Iris to lower herself slowly, to avoid direct eye contact, to breathe as deeply and evenly as her racing heart would allow. She reminded her that the leopard was not hunting her, that its posture suggested curiosity and caution rather than aggression, and that sudden movement, born from panic, remained far more dangerous than the animal itself. Iris followed the instructions with visible effort, her shoulders dropping slightly, her breathing slowing by careful degrees, and the leopard, sensing the shift in energy, eventually turned and moved unhurried back into the tree line, leaving the young recruit standing alone in the clearing, shaken but unharmed. This had become Grace's life in recent years, less about facing danger herself and more about teaching others to face it, with the same steady presence she had spent a lifetime developing. She had taken on a formal role at the training academy, where she herself had once struggled to prove her worth to skeptical instructors, and she approached the position with a philosophy that had taken her years to fully articulate, even to herself. She did not believe she possessed some rare, unteachable gift that set her apart from everyone else who worked in wildlife conservation. She believed, instead, that most people carried within them the capacity for the same calm presence she had relied on throughout her career, buried beneath layers of instinctive fear that modern life rarely gave anyone the chance to work through. When journalists occasionally still sought her out, hoping for a dramatic explanation involving some mystical connection to the animal kingdom, Grace offered them a version of the truth that rarely satisfied their appetite for spectacle. She explained that animals, across every species she had encountered throughout her career, responded far more strongly to genuine calm than to any display of dominance or force. She explained that fear carried a scent, a posture, a rhythm of breathing and movement that predators had evolved over countless generations to recognize instantly, because fear so often signaled either prey or threat, both of which demanded a reaction. When that fear simply was not present, when a person's body carried no signals of panic or aggression, animals frequently found themselves without a clear category to place the human standing before them, and in that uncertainty, many chose caution over confrontation. She also acknowledged, in quieter moments with colleagues she trusted, that some part of her ability likely stemmed from a lifetime of exposure that had shaped her nervous system in ways science had not yet fully mapped. She had grown up surrounded by dangerous wildlife from her earliest memories, absorbing lessons about animal behavior long before she consciously understood what she was learning. This early exposure, she believed, had built a kind of foundation within her that later training only refined rather than created entirely from nothing. She often told her students that while she could teach them techniques, postures, and vocal tones that measurably improved their odds during dangerous encounters, she could not simply transfer the deep, instinctive comfort she carried, the product of a childhood spent watching leopards from behind a fence rather than fearing them from a distance. Nathaniel Cole, now nearing retirement after decades of service to the Wildlife Trust, often visited the academy to watch Grace teach, taking quiet satisfaction in seeing the 13-year-old girl he had once questioned about a leopard sighting grow into someone capable of shaping an entire generation of rangers. He told her once, during one of these visits, that he believed her greatest contribution to conservation work would not be measured by the individual animals she had saved through her own encounters, remarkable as those stories were, but by the ripple effect of everything she had taught to the rangers who passed through her training, each of whom would go on to prevent countless future conflicts, using lessons that traced directly back to her. Gideon Marsh, the instructor who had once doubted her so openly during her own training years earlier, eventually became one of her most consistent collaborators at the academy, the two of them developing a joint curriculum that combined traditional ranger skills with the behavioral techniques Grace had spent her career refining. He never fully abandoned his belief in the importance of conventional training, weapons proficiency, and physical preparedness, but he came to understand, through years of watching her work, that these skills alone left significant gaps that her approach could fill, in ways nothing else could. Their partnership became something of a quiet legend within the trust. Two instructors who had once clashed sharply, now standing side by side, teaching recruits that true safety in the field came from combining preparedness with presence, force with understanding. Charlotte Hughes, Grace's close friend since their earliest days at the academy, had gone on to lead the trust's research division, and together, the two women spent years documenting patterns from Grace's encounters, building a body of evidence that eventually influenced conservation practices far beyond their own reserve. Wildlife management programs in other countries began incorporating elements of Grace's methods into their own ranger training, adapting her techniques to different species and different landscapes, though few claimed the same consistent success she had achieved throughout her own career. Charlotte often joked that Grace had built an entire field of study, almost by accident, simply by refusing to be afraid of things everyone else assumed she should fear. Not every story from Grace's later career involved dramatic encounters or life-threatening danger. Many of her proudest moments came from quieter victories, the slow rebuilding of trust between struggling communities and the wildlife populations they had once viewed only as threats to their livelihoods. She spent considerable time in her later years working directly with farming communities near the reserve, teaching practical, non-violent methods for protecting crops and livestock from wildlife incursions, methods that reduced the frequency of dangerous confrontations on both sides. She believed deeply that lasting conservation success depended not just on protecting animals from poachers, but on helping the people who lived alongside those animals feel genuinely safe, rather than constantly under siege from creatures they had little power to control. One afternoon, many years after the wounded lioness had been treated and released back into the reserve, Grace received word from a research team monitoring the reserve's lion population that a collared female matching the old tracking data had been spotted with a new litter of cubs near a watering hole several kilometers from where the original incident had taken place. Curious, and needing little excuse to spend an afternoon back in the field rather than behind a desk at the academy, Grace made the journey out to observe from a respectful distance, accompanied by a small team that included Ruth Okafor, still working as a tracker for the trust after all these years. They found the lioness resting in the shade near the water's edge, 3 cubs tumbling over each other nearby, in the kind of playful chaos that marked healthy, thriving young animals. The lioness's leg, though still bearing a faint scar from the old snare wound, showed no signs of ongoing injury, her movements strong and confident as she rose briefly to check on her cubs before settling back into the shade. Grace watched from a distance through a pair of binoculars, feeling a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition or reputation, and everything to do with the simple fact that an animal she had once helped save was now thriving, raising a new generation that would carry on without ever knowing the danger their mother had survived. As they prepared to leave, the lioness lifted her head, her gaze drifting toward the small group observing from a distance. Grace lowered her binoculars, meeting the animal's eyes across the open ground, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Ruth, standing beside her, later said she could have sworn the lioness held that gaze longer than casual curiosity would explain, though she also admitted that perhaps she had simply absorbed too many stories about Grace over the years to view the moment with complete objectivity. Whatever the truth of that particular exchange, the lioness eventually looked away, returning her attention to her cubs, and Grace felt no need to read more meaning into the moment than it could honestly hold. In interviews conducted later in her career, when asked to reflect on the countless encounters that had defined her reputation, Grace consistently returned to a single central idea, one she had come to believe more deeply with each passing year. She explained that most conflict between humans and wildlife stemmed not from any inherent hostility between the two, but from a profound and mutual misunderstanding, each side reading danger into signals the other never intended to send. Humans, driven by instinctive fear, often behaved in ways that animals interpreted as threats, provoking defensive reactions that then confirmed human fears in a cycle that repeated endlessly across generations. She believed her own contribution, if it could be called that, was simply proof that breaking this cycle was possible, that presence and patience could replace fear and force without sacrificing safety, and that this lesson mattered far beyond the specific encounters that had made her story so widely known. She often ended these reflections by returning to the earliest memory that had shaped her entire life, the hyena, standing quietly outside her family's cabin, while a 9-year-old girl watched without fear. She said she still did not fully understand why that moment had unfolded the way it did, why she had felt calm rather than terror, why the animal had chosen to walk away rather than press forward. But she had come to believe, after a lifetime spent studying the question from every possible angle, that the answer mattered less than what she had built from it. She had turned an unexplainable instinct into a discipline into a career, and a career into a legacy that would continue shaping how humans and wildlife encountered one another long after she herself had stepped back from the front lines. As the sun set over the reserve on the evening of that visit to the watering hole, Grace stood beside her team, watching the lioness settle in for the night, with her cubs gathered close against her side. She thought, not for the first time, about the strange path that had carried her from a frightened father's flashlight beam sweeping across a dark yard to this quiet moment of peace, watching an animal she had once helped save, now raising a family of her own. She thought about Iris Kellerman, the trembling young recruit who had faced her own leopard earlier that year, and walked away steadier for the experience. She thought about the dozens of rangers who had passed through her training over the years, carrying pieces of what she had taught them into reserves and conservation projects across the region and beyond. No single encounter, however dramatic, had ever fully explained who Grace Ellison was, or why animals seemed to recognize something in her that they did not find in most other people. But taken together, across a lifetime of quiet, careful moments, a pattern had emerged, one that spoke less to any mystical gift and more to a simple, difficult truth that Grace had spent her entire life proving, through action rather than words. Fear was not armor. Weapons were not the only form of strength. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a person could offer, to a predator or to another human being, was the simple, steady presence of someone who had learned not to be afraid of the wrong things, and who understood, more deeply than most ever would, that respect, patience, and genuine calm could accomplish what force alone never could. The stars began appearing over the reserve as Grace and her team finally turned to make their way back to the vehicle, the lioness and her cubs settling into the darkness behind them, safe, unharmed, and free to continue the quiet, ordinary rhythm of life in the wild that Grace had spent her entire career working to protect. She carried no weapon that evening, as she had carried none through countless encounters before it, and as she walked away from the watering hole under the darkening sky, she felt, as she so often did in these quiet moments after danger had passed, that she had finally found exactly the life she had been meant to live, one built not on the ability to overpower the wild, but on the rare and lasting gift of being understood by it.